Hi, I'm Malcolm Nason, retired controller. I've a great interest in aviation from the time I was in school right up to the present day. I like photographing aircraft, travel worldwide to do it. And I started off as an aircraft spotter, as they call them, logging numbers in the logbook, and then moved to photography as well and dropped the logging after a few years.
What age were you when you started in spotting?
I would say it was 1962, so I'd have been 15.
Okay, and was it you were brought up in Dublin, so
yes.
Dublin Airport you went to mainly?
Dublin Airport mainly, yes. I had a couple of friends in school. One lived in Clontarf, and there were other fellas I met up with regularly at the airport.
And Dublin Airport was a tiny being compared to nowadays.
Compared to what it is now, but it was a friendly place, and you could get away with walking out on the apron and various things back then.
And what was it piqued your interest in aviation?
I suppose it was just the physical presence of airplanes, and I specifically like the older, bigger airplanes is my specific interest.
So you had 707s,
No, going back before that, DC4s, DC6s, DC7s, Super Constellations, jets are for kids.
Of course, the balcony on Dublin Airport was fantastic for spotting as well.
Yes, that was very good. And then they opened the Finger Building, which had a balcony the whole length of it. That was perfect.
Okay, and of course you could get nice shots on the final approach onto runway 24 up by Forest Little.
Yes, you could do. That was a good place, yeah.
Okay, when you moved into photography, so it was about that same time as well? You're about 14, 15, was it? Or was it just spotting to begin with?
Just spotting to begin with. I quickly moved into photography, but the camera I had for initially was very, very basic. And but then my father knew this guy, and he was importing cameras from Russia. So I got a 35mm Zenit camera, and it had a fixed lens, 50mm lens, and also had interchangeable 135mm lens. So that set me up well, and it was cheap, like.
And if you were to look at it now and looking back over all those years, what would be your standout favorite aeroplane?
I would imagine the Super Constellation. Yes, the way it taxied and the nose wheel cocked over. And that, it was a superb airplane. Aer Lingus had 3 of them on the transatlantic at one stage for a short time. And
you have as your profile picture on Flickr, you have the old, what's ended up in the TWA Museum in the States, November 7777 Golf, which was parked at Dublin for years. I remember it being there.
That's right, yes.
And that's been restored.
That's a standard Constellation, not the super one, yeah. I remember that well.
But what I asked you to do, and it's a bit unfair, I asked you to kind of pick out your favorite photographs, be it a favorite plane or a favorite location or a favorite memory that came with it. And I think you picked out about 40 that we can go through.
Yeah.
So the first one, Malcolm, if you want to introduce that one.
That's a Handley Page Hermes at Dublin Airport, probably back in early 1963. It was the last one of its type to fly, and that was probably its last visit to Dublin.
Okay, and again, it's very much like the old DC6.
It is, in a way. It's a 4-engined piston airliner. It was made in the UK by Handley Page. BOAC used them. Early in my career, photography, they made 2 films in Dublin featuring World War II aircraft. This was the Blue Max and Darling Lily. And for this, they built replica World War II planes and flew them out of Ballydonnell, using a lot of Air Corps pilots to actually fly them. Tragically, one lost his life. One of the Air Corps pilots lost his life in a mid-air collision between him and the camera ship helicopter. So that was a bit of a tragedy associated with that filming. They're German Fokker triplanes.
Okay.
They're not the real, they're replicas, but they were flyable replicas.
And was there one of them that flew through the arches over the River Boyne?
It is rumoured that it is true. I could not confirm that. This is a Piper super cruiser based at Weston, owned by Bob Levis, who was our television supply man. He had a shop down in Bathmines, and he was very friendly with my father, and that was the first plane I ever flew in. He took me up on a trip on it. Interesting, when we were taxiing out, the tail wheel fell off, but he just got out, bolted back on, and away we went. Just a local flight round down towards the mountains and back into Weston. Now, my first airliner flight was in an Aer Lingus DC3. I was in the Boy Scouts, and we did 2 summer camps, one in Guernsey and one in St. Malo in northern France. And to get there, we flew in an Aer Lingus DC3. This is not an actual Aer Lingus DC3 in the photograph. This is one that was done up more recent years. It's done up in Aer Lingus colours. It's a South African registered one. And it flew a while in Aer Lingus colours around the air show circuit. And now it's in Germany, but the Aer Lingus titles have been taken off it. You can probably see there it has ACD on the tail. They weren't allowed to fly it with the EIACD, which was an original registration for an Aer Lingus DC3. The 747 is a thing of great beauty, no doubt. An engineering feat at the time, I suppose. This is the first Aer Lingus one, taxiing in at Shannon on its delivery flight from Seattle. Compared with other aircraft that were flying at the time, this was absolutely huge.
The next ones that you put down here will be your prop liners.
Oh yeah, I'm big into prop liners. This is what really started me off, like, you know. And this one is a US Navy operated aircraft named El Coyote. It was based at Shannon. It was one of several aircraft back in the late 60s based at Shannon doing ocean survey work. There's an interesting story about that one. Some of the spotters were down at Dublin to get it. It was a Sunday morning. We knew it was going on a mission. I think there were 4 or 5 spotters. 4 of them went off to Mass. 1 didn't. He walked down the road, got chatting to the crew, and got brought along on the mission. The others saw green with envy.
And that person was you, was it?
No, I'm afraid not. I was working at the time.
Okay. And how did you find being able to combine your love of airplanes with being paid to look out at them? And how did you find that, you know, obviously it was a huge benefit to you then.
Obviously you knew what was coming. And the tower balcony provided a great photo point. I was living at the airport. I was living in the hostels right beside the taxiway. So there were great photo opportunities. And later then, when things tightened up a bit, our IDs allowed us ramp access. So this is this is a Curtiss C-46. And this is the last one in Dublin, operated by Fred Olsen Lines from Norway. And I was on a course in Dublin at the time, and it pottered in, so I had to take an urgent coffee break, and I got someone to take me out to it. So I love that old airplane. Like, this is a DC-6. Lovely to see an action shot like this. These ones are still flying, would you believe, in Alaska. It's operated by a company called Everett's Air Fuel. What they do is they have tanks inside in the aircraft, and they fly fuel out to remote stations around Alaska. They've several of those, and some of those C-40. They even have one of those C-46s still going. This is just this is my first visit to Miami back in 1981, and this is just an interesting photograph, a crossover, 2 Martin 404s of Florida Airlines. It's just one was landing on the cross runway and the other was lining up on the runway. Flying boats are a real pet love of mine. This one is VP-LVE, short Sandringham, operated by Antilles flying boat, the famous Charlie Blair, who flew the last flying boat out of Foynes and one of the first DC4s back into Shannon with Pan Am. He had this airline, Antilles flying boats. He brought it over to Ireland in 1975. He's married to our famous Maureen O'Hara, the actress, and that's her at the front door of the airplane. And the lady in the rowing boat is her sister, being rowed out to meet her. Now, later, that was in Foynes, but they did pleasure flights, but out of Killaloe because they didn't want to have it on the salt water, so they flew it up to Killaloe and operated out of there. A couple of days later, I got a flight in that one met Maureen O'Hara and Charlie Blair, very friendly people, very nice. Got a flight in it down to their house in Glengariff, so that was something else. And that flying boat, Charlie Blair unfortunately was killed in an accident with his airline a couple of years later, and the aircraft was brought over to England, was going to the museum in England, and they had it at Killaloe for, in 1981, they brought it to Killaloe to winter, and then the next spring, it was flown to Calshot. The pilot was a guy called Ron Gillies, and he had flown with Charlie Blair, but our local pilot, Brian Carpenter, was to act as co-pilot for the flight to Calshot. The plane got delayed by weather conditions, and Brian couldn't do it. So Ron Gillies knew of me. He contacted me. He said, did I know any other pilot who would do it? And I said, yes. He had to have a multi-engine rating. He didn't have to ever have sat in a flying boat, but he had to have a multi-engine rating. And one of our controllers, Ollie Bennett, filled the spot. So he took the job, and I blagged my way onto the flight. So I was on the very last flight that airplane ever made from Killaloe to Calshot.
And Ollie was a neighbour of yours here in
Yes,
the
he lived just across the road there, yeah. His wife still lives there. Now, this is the sister ship, and this is one that wasn't fully converted to Sandringham standard. It's Sunderland, like they flew in the war. And after Charlie Blair died, this was brought over to Europe, to England, and it was to go to the Foynes Flying Boat Museum, and Ryanair were sponsoring it, hence the big Ryanair titles on the side of it and their logo on the tail. It arrived in Foynes all right. There were great celebrations, and whatever sort of deal there was fell through, and the aircraft returned to the UK without ever staying in Foynes. So it's now retired in a museum in the US. This is just another sample of my travels abroad. This is a flying boat in a museum in China. So that's just illustrating kind of the other side of the world, the flying boats there.
You seem to have an interest in the firebombers as well. They're
an interesting subject. Aircraft specifically converted for firebombing duties, fighting fire as far as. These are two. This is at an air show in France. These are two firebombers operated by the Sécurité Civile in France, doing a formation flight at an air show in France. The one in front is a Grumman tracker, now called a Firecat. It was converted in Canada and now based in France. The one behind is a modern, specifically built Canadair CL415, specifically built for firefighting duties. It can land in water, scoop the water, and drop it then. It's a flying boat. The other one has to be filled on the ground with retardant. This is an old DC-6. You can see the firebombing retardant tank under the belly. This is at Shannon, one that was positioning home to Canada, where it was based after the season in Europe. It was based down in Italy. This is probably the nicest firefighter I've ever seen. Martin Mars flying boat, a massive thing. This is on Sprout Lake in Vancouver. They had two of them. They're no longer in service. One was to go to a museum, but that fell through. And as far as I know, the two of them are still at Sprout Lake, out of the water. But that was one massive fire bomber. The air-to-airs came about through my good friend, the late Paul Duffy, very involved in Irish aviation. Everyone knew him and knows him. And tragically, he died about 15 years ago. But it was he kind of arranged the air-to-airs. That was his thing. And whether he charged people for it or he'd bring other people along and charge them, but it was he put it together. I was brought along free gratis, thankfully, and my job was to coordinate with ATC. Paul Duffy was a great friend, and his wife, who died as well long before him, and we were family friends as well. But he was very helpful, and we'll get round to the Russian thing afterwards, but he was what generated, he bringing me there generated my interest in the Russian aviation, which is another big thing. It's a Boeing 247. It was en route to the Science Museum in England, at Rawton, and it was being ferried from the USA, and it night stopped in Dublin, and this was over Wicklow, departing for the UK. As you can see, it was losing a bit of oil on the number 2 engine. Now, you might think doing air-to-airs of a Cubana aircraft would be impossible. Not at all. The Cuban crews were only too happy to do it, even though they must have had security guys with them. But they were fantastic at keeping formation, because they were probably all ex-military pilots. And when you locked on with the formation, they could hold it. That was taken down near Foynes after departed 06, I think, and we formated down towards Foynes. Very low, about 3,000 or 4,000 feet. Anywhere I go around the world, we always go to museums. It's amazing, the aircraft and the background to them you can see in museums. This is probably this is the most recent museum I visited, the Italian Air Force Museum. We had a trip to Italy to take in the 100th anniversary air show for the Italian Air Force. This was a float plane that was there. There were so many amazing types of aircraft in this museum that I'd never seen or heard of even before. So this is a Grumman tracker in the museum in Taiwan. Again, an interesting museum with lots of aircraft that you wouldn't have normally seen for the political and geographic reasons. Also, they had an outside collection of some of the bigger aircraft. This is a museum in Kalamazoo near Detroit. It's called the Air Zoo Museum, but they have a nice collection of aircraft with interesting lighting effects to set them off. This is an SR71. This is a 2-seat version. It was built as a spy plane, but this is a NASA one, which was used for other purposes. This is just a nice photograph of my pet, the Super Constellation, in the museum at Peterson Air Force Base in the US, just looking down the driveway, and I've called it Memory Lane. You all know about the B-29, the famous bomber from the World War II. The Russians copied it, called it a Tu-4. They sold it to the Chinese, put turboprop engines on it, and used it as an airborne early warning aircraft. And this is in the museum in China. This is an aircraft called a Tu-116. There's only one built. It's in the museum in Manila. It was specifically built to fly Khrushchev to a UN meeting in New York, because they thought the Tu-114 would not be ready at the time, and they just converted. This is basically a conversion of the Bear bomber which they had, but in actual fact the bigger aircraft was available in time. This is what Airbus use. This is the modern one, what they used to fly outside loads around, built out of an A330, would you believe. Before that they had the Boeing Super Guppy, which was a propeller aircraft, but this is a conversion of the A330. They have 4 or 5 of them. They fly outside fuselage pieces between the Airbus factories in Europe. Airbus use Shannon for crosswind flight testing. When they get the winds, you'll see them come up from Toulouse to do crosswind flight checks. This is an earlier version of the Guppy. This is a mini Guppy, again converted from a C-97 and Stratocruiser. This is the Antonov AN225, the biggest aircraft ever built. It used to come through Shannon quite a bit for fuel stops, and it was built by Antonov again for carrying outside loads. It could even had a roof rack built on it, but I don't think they ever used it for carrying the Buran spacecraft, but I don't think they ever used it for that. Unfortunately, this aircraft was destroyed in Kiev during the Russian invasion there last year, and they hit it and it was written off. Shannon and the Concorde have a long association. It's hard to believe now that it's over 20 years since it's out of service. And we had the first Concorde in Shannon in 1975. It was a French one. This is a British Airways one, which was on a crew training flight in Shannon. French factory when one came in on a demonstration flight. My father-in-law worked for ESSO. They were fueling it, so I got ramp access to photograph it for them. We had them a lot on crew training, both the French and the British Airways ones, as well as a couple of diversions. This is a Russian, this is a Miashiev Atlant. Again, it's a Russian aircraft, and it has this container strapped on the roof, which they can carry a spacecraft and things in. That's basically what it was used for. They also have a smaller container, which I've seen it fly with as well.
Talking of things being strapped on the roof, I think in your collection I have seen, was it a 707 with a Citreon strapped to the roof of it in Shannon?
That's correct. That was for a film. On that occasion, they were to fly the 707 with the Citreon on the roof. The authorities here wouldn't approve it, so they went to France and did it in France. They actually flew the airplane with the Citreon strapped to the roof. But they did the ground effects on a different airplane here. Had the cameras up close and the smoke effect for the clouds and that. So this is Konkordsky. This one is, Russians had an equivalent of the Concorde called the TU144. They didn't last too long in civil use because they weren't very successful. This particular one had been withdrawn from use, but then it was contracted by Boeing, McDonnell Douglas, and some other American companies for some test flying. And Tupolev rejigged it, re-engined it, and they did some test flying for the American companies. Perestroika was enforced then. As I said earlier, I have done a huge amount of trips throughout the world. This is one of my early days on a trip to Heathrow. Back then, even couldn't afford Aer Lingus airfares. We used to go to Heathrow on the boat. I mean, you hadn't lived till you crossed the Irish Sea in the Princess Maud, and the train, it was great. It was a steam train down to London, and then bussed around the London airports. But this was MEA VC10 at least back then. Unfortunately, it wasn't that successful. But the RAF had them for a while. They were the last operators. They took a lot of the ex-BOAC ones. This is my first trip abroad. Myself and my good friend Bill Powderly, who we were very close friends, still are. We travelled a lot together back then, mostly to UK. He had a brother living in England, and I had an uncle living in London, and we used to travel quite a lot. Even one time he brought over his Honda 50 and we travelled around on it. We did our first, I would say, long-range trip to Brussels and Copenhagen back in 1969, and boat and train was the way to get there, but we were coming from England to Belgium, and we were to go on the boat and train. But coming at the station, we saw a sign which said Rail Air fare, and it was dirt cheap. So we got the train to Southend and got on a Carvair and flew to Ostend and took it from there. So this is a Turkish Air Force DC3. Again, my passion for old props at Brussels Airport. And I saw this very same aircraft many years later, back in 2011, in a museum in Turkey. The same aircraft is in the Turkish Air Force Museum. This was on another trip to Czechoslovakia and Poland, Polish Air Force IL-14. We got to fly in it, which was only magical, you can imagine. I was travelling with an English tour group, which I did a lot of trips with. Alpha Mike Tours, Andy Marsh. He was a controller at Heathrow, but he used to organise these aviation trips for groups. One of the places to see in the US is the Air Force Base at Davis Mountain. Here they store all the out-of-use American Air Force aircraft. The place is vast and there's all types. This photograph shows B-52s which have been withdrawn Now you will notice that the fuselages and wings have been cut. This under the SALT treaty. They had to do this in the open, display them in the open for so many years, so the Russians could verify that they had actually withdrawn and cannibalized the aircraft. This is the Boeing. This is the short version of the Boeing 747. This Boeing 747 SP. This one is on approach to Hong Kong, the old Kai Tak Airport, where they had a very interesting approach. The ILS wasn't lined up with the runway. It was lined up with a point about 3/4 of a mile out, and the aircraft would fly down the ILS and make a sharp right turn for the airport. It's called the checkerboard approach because where the ILS terminated, there was a hill which they painted a big checkerboard on to make it stand out for pilots. And they used to make these tight turn in, then they fly the ILS and then make this tight turn in. I even saw a Concorde doing that once. It was absolutely amazing. A tight turn, and it was in poor weather and the moisture was flowing off the wings. Air shows are another thing. You visit regularly, My first air show was at Aldergrove back in 1963 when I was in military base. That went from there, I've travelled the world to air shows, different types, the civil ones, mostly military. They always provide interesting flying, display teams, etc. And the Red Arrows and all those are worth seeing. This is now at an air show in Singapore, and this is back in 2020. We were there just as COVID was beginning. This is the Chinese aerobatic team displaying. This is one of the first air shows I went to in the UK. It was the 50th anniversary of the RAF. They had a fabulous static display with some of the old types the RAF used to fly. They dragged them out of museums and everything. This was a Handley Page Hastings, which a type that was based in Aldergrove back in the day. They used to fly maritime patrols out of Aldergrove. This is the Turkish Air Force 100th Anniversary Air Show, which was a superb event, well organised. This is a Turkish Air Force KC135 tanker doing a fly past. You can see the tail boom is extended. That was one of many aircraft to fly by and perfect weather conditions. We all remember in air traffic control, bears sighted in the ocean. This is a Tupolev bear bomber, long-range reconnaissance and bomber. This was flying at the air show in Zhukovsky. I went to several air shows in Zhukovsky, the Russian test airfield. I have many stories about that. Paul Duffy is responsible for me ending up with these Russian trips. A couple of Zhukovskys I went to with him. The first one I went to, the air show was actually outside the airbase because it was a secure facility. We were brought down a riverbank and the aircraft displayed outside the airbase, and they had a small static display in the town. But they opened up then and they had an annual show. Basically, it was a trade show sort of thing, and it was well worth attending. Again, all sorts of unusual aircraft. I was offside, shall we say, at one stage and got pulled in by a young fella. I was where I shouldn't have been. He pulled me in a room in a building. I took the lens off the camera, took the film out, put another blank film in, and put the camera away. And he came back and he brought me down to the gate guards. And there were already a couple of Dutch spotters there. So they didn't speak English. We didn't speak Russian. So they got a translator. The girl came along and she said, "Don't worry," she said, "I'll sort this out." So she did, and they just gave us a form to sign to say that we wouldn't use professional cameras. That bit is not here, it's actually making a turn. It's photographed actually. They brought us up on top of the hangar to photograph. It's actually making a turn during its display. Airlines often paint their aircraft in special colours to commemorate events, anniversaries, just for decoration really. This is a DHL Boeing 757 that was painted up with the rainbow colours to celebrate Pride, the well-known rainbow colours. This is a special event. This aircraft was flown by the airline Transaero, Russian airline. They owned the maintenance facility here in Shannon. They went bust. This aircraft was withdrawn from use. It was purchased by a guy up in Sligo who was going to use it in an amusement park. It was dismantled and it was brought up to Sligo by sea. The wings were taken off it down by the hangar. It was put on a truck, driven up the airfield at Shannon, cut in the fence, out onto the road, and with great skills, the truck driver got it down to the lagoon, where it was craned into the air and put on a barge and towed up the west coast to Sligo, where it was loaded. It's still there. His project failed, and as far as I know, it's still up there in his field. This again is just a nice colour scheme, just celebrating pandas, some movies or something. This is a Chinese Boeing 787 approach to Beijing of Hainan Airlines. Now, this is one crash I remember at Shannon. I was sitting here one evening and it was dark, and I heard this noise pass the approach, and it sounded wrong. It said something wrong. I put on my airband radio to see what it was, and the first thing I heard was TWA 881 now. Where is our number one? Without batting an eyelid, and I heard the tower controllers. The number one has just crashed. So I got into my car, shot around, and I got around by the end of the 2-4 threshold. I could see flames and smoke billowing out of the field. I said, time for me to be out of here. And I went home. The fire crew hadn't even arrived on the scene at this stage. It was across the road from the threshold of 2-4. And as you can see, the aircraft is severely damaged on that side. There was a fire, but thankfully it spun around. The other side of the aircraft is undamaged, and the crew got out and walked over and sat on the wall and waited for the fire crew to come. There was even a car on board. One of the crew had a car on it, which suffered no damage. The Air Corps, to celebrate their anniversary, painted one of their PC12s in this special scheme, the modern scheme on the front and the old scheme. This aircraft, again, another big Antonov, the Antonov AN22, an amazing big aircraft. Again, one of my favorites, fills several likes. Russia, prop, big. And this was in Shannon, taking off, and Shannon made an amazing sound taking off. Again, this aircraft was badly damaged in the Russian attack on Kiev. This is on my trip to South Africa in 1999 and Lanzaria Airport. This DC-6 was flown by a pilot called Flippy Vermeulen. He did various things on it. This is it taking off. Later that day, myself and Andy Marsh, who ran the tours, were at another place, and Andy got a phone call to say he was going down to Swarfkov with the DC-6. Would he like to come? So the other members of the group were out photographing light aircraft. I stayed in the terminal building because I wasn't interested. And Andy says, do you want to come? He's offered us a lift to Swarfkov. You bet, I said. So we went off and we got a flight down to Swarfkov in this airplane. That was in 1999. This aircraft is still flying today, based in Austria, operated by Red Bull on the flying show circuit. And this is the same aircraft I photographed here at the Italian Air Force Air Show this year. So it's still going strong, in immaculate condition. In 1997, Swissair were celebrating their 50th anniversary of transatlantic operations, and they brought this South African registered DC-4 up to Switzerland, and they flew 2 round trips to New York with it, with fuel stops at Shannon and Gander. While it was in Shannon one time, because Swissair owned part of Shannon Aerospace, they took some of their employees in it around the Aran Islands. So that's when I got the opportunity with Paul to do this air-to-air photograph of it, with the burn in the background. I'd flown in a similar type down in South Africa. As well as the DC-6, we flew in a DC-4 down there. I've met many, many good friends over the years. To mention a few, Paul Duffy I've already mentioned, very close with him. There were a good bunch of guys in Dublin, Ray Flynn, John Bigley, Bill Powderly I already mentioned, still very friendly with him. Gordon Wilson, he was in school with me. We cycled to Shannon after our intercert back in 1963. We got on our bikes and we cycled to Shannon. And he didn't do too well after the leaving, and his parents packed him off to Canada, where his sister was, and he did extremely well. He joined the Canadian Air Force, was a pilot, became a pilot, ended up as a captain, flew with several airlines, ended up as a captain with Air Canada. Now he's comfortably retired in Vancouver. Another special friend was Stephen Piercy. I met him here way back And he'd come over to Shannon specifically to fly with the famous Duncan Baker in his Super Constellation. And the flight kept getting delayed and delayed, and he kept waiting and waiting. His father was going frantic because he was to start a job with flight as the company photographer, and he was already late for turning up. But anyway, he held on and he got his Super Constellation flight. Tragically, Stephen was killed in an air-to-air collision. He was doing air-to-air photography for flight, and the two aircraft collided, and he died in that accident. But it was a thing, the air-to-air photography, where you had to make your arrangements very precisely. Everyone had to know where the other airplane was, and if you lost sight of each other, what to do. So there were many other friends. Now, specifically, I have to mention my wife and family in this interview. Without her, I wouldn't have been able to do any of these things. She was fantastic in what she allowed me to do and encouraged me to do. And I owe her a huge debt of thanks, for sticking with me through it all.
Does she share your love of aeroplanes?
No.
Can she understand your love of aeroplanes?
I think she does, yes. In recent trips then, I've travelled with people from Shannon and Sean O'Brien, who used to work in the radio section in IAA, Trevor, who works in the airport, and our leader, who makes all the arrangements, a guy called Danny Boylan, who's a real aviation enthusiast, and to his detriment, he's not a photographer, but he makes all the arrangements, and he's just the numbers man. He just writes down the numbers. But I say when we're abroad, he must find us very frustrating, but he's great. He's really great. And there are a number of people who worked in the airport who are enthusiasts. Dave O'Mahony worked in our area until now. He was very good. He used to provide lots of background information because he used to do the traffic sheets. So back in the days, you had to rely on people working in the airport to hear what was coming, because now you have Flight Radar 24 and you can find out what's coming, where it is, and time your visit to the airport accordingly. I did the photography for Shannon Aerospace from the time they opened till beginning of 2000 till after 9/11. I did do the photography for the painting hangar, which has gone through several companies, and currently is IAC. I do it up to the present day, so I'm expecting to do one exactly this afternoon, in fact. I also have do photography, supply various magazines and book authors with photographs for use as well throughout the years, and I'm a regular contributor to Irish Air Letter magazine. Anyone who wants to look at my photographs is welcome to look at them on Flickr. I'm on as Malcolm Nason, or Shan Air Pic, SHANAIRPIC. You're welcome to come and look at all the photographs I've put up over the years.
Malcolm, thank you.
Thank you.